All right, welcome back. This is part 4 of chapter 2 of the Rathus Introductory Psychology text. This will be the last video for chapter 2. In the previous video, we looked at the brain, the different parts of the brain, and sort of traced the brain, the different parts of the brain from an evolutionary perspective, going from like the hindbrain, the earliest portions of the brain that have developed, and into some of the newer, into the midbrain, and then eventually the forebrain, the most evolved portion of our brain. So far we've been talking about the ways in which the body sort of communicates within itself, and we've been looking at the nervous system, which is a very fast way of communication, meaning, neurons firing within the nervous system fire at rates that are far too fast to detect with even the human eye. We're talking about nanoseconds, microseconds, really very fast periods of time. So now we're going to transition and look at sort of the body's other method of communication within itself. And it's a much slower communication system, and that is the endocrine system. So we'll be looking at glands, these sort of these ductless glands that produce hormones that are spread throughout the body. They secrete hormones into the bloodstream, and we'll talk. These hormones have an effect on the way we think and the way we behave. So, hormones are really important. Neurons fire nerve cells and neural impulse as well. The endocrine system relays hormones, and those things are very important for a number of functions. For one, they regulate growth. As you're growing and developing as a human being, your body is secreting certain hormones to make sure that process, works just right. It regulates your metabolism. How much you're going to eat or want to eat, or how active you are. It's a part of regulating certain behaviors. I mean, think about your behaviors in terms of like fight or flight. We've talked about this before. Rest and digest, very different experiences, but are both being regulated by different hormones. So, hormones are also responsible for regulating, bodily states like homeostasis, being in a sort of state of balance. And there's a really interesting sort of negative feedback loop going on with our hormones. So we, when a gland is signaled to stop when the right amount of hormone has been secreted, sometimes the gland will keep producing even sometimes when, even afterwards. So really interesting. We're gonna spend some time with hormones here. Again, sort of a slower method of communication, and we're not going to cover the entire gamut of hormones and glands, but we're going to talk about some important ones. So this is just a kind of a nutshell: the endocrine glands, the endocrine system. We're not going to cover everything listed here, but you can see that we have endocrine glands all throughout our body, even in our brain, and the pineal and hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. We have some sort of in the chest and the throat area, our thyroid, parathyroid, all that good stuff. The adrenal glands sitting atop of our kidneys, the pancreas, the kidneys. All of this stuff is important, and it's spread throughout the body. So we're not going to go over every single one of these items or these different glands, but we're going to talk about a few of them. The first is the pituitary gland. Sometimes you hear it referred to as the master gland, because it kind of regulates all of the other glands in the body. So it's sort of like the overlord or the master of all the other glands. And if we go back to the chart, it's right below the hypothalamus. Now, hopefully the hypothalamus, you see that word and that draws up some memories from the last video we talked about. The hypothalamus is one of those, it's a part of the brain that's not only part of the nervous system because it's part of the brain, but it's also part of the endocrine system because it helps regulate this hypothalamus. So it's regulate the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus kind of is in between, being both endocrine and being both part of the nervous system. So really interesting function there. The pituitary gland also secrete hormones that are involved in the functioning of other glands. Again, remember, it regulates all the other glands, so it's going to secrete certain hormones like prolactin, vasopressin, oxytocin. I think you've probably heard of oxytocin before, the feel-good hormone. When you hug somebody or somebody hugs you, your body releases oxytocin, and it feels good. That's why, giving your mom a hug, or your boyfriend, your girlfriend, or your partner, if they hug you, it makes you feel better. You're releasing these hormones in your body. The hypothalamus, as I mentioned earlier, regulates pituitary activity, so it's part of the it's part of the endocrine and the nervous system as well. So that's the pituitary gland, very important. The pineal gland is important as well. It secretes melatonin, which, when you're trying to fall asleep, this is the hormone that runs through your blood and helps you fall asleep. It's what your body produces naturally, as the day starts to transition into the night. As you cut out light, the body starts to produce melatonin. You can also take melatonin on your own and make yourself, start to feel sleepy. The pineal gland, again, it's kind of involved. Its primary duty is involved in melatonin, but it might be disrupted or might be affected by puberty. You find sometimes teenagers want to sleep a lot, or sometimes they have a really hard time sleeping. This could be because the pineal gland's kind of acting all out of sync during puberty, and maybe there's too much melatonin or too little. So it's also connected with aging, and also, melatonin is acting as a mild sedative. If you've ever taken melatonin to fall asleep, it's one of the most effective ways to fall asleep. And most of the time, if I take melatonin, it knocks me right out. So other people, maybe not so much, but it can be a mild sedative. So pineal gland, it's involved with sleep. Let's talk about the thyroid gland. It's involved with metabolism, having metabolism, It produces a substance called thyroxine, which is what regulates our metabolism. Our metabolism is kind of like our body's thermometer, not measuring the temperature, but measures things like calorie consumption and how much energy you need to expend to kind of burn off those calories. It's sort of a thermometer in that sense. But thyroxine is really important. Again, it affects our metabolism. And we see that, it's one of those things in our body that either too much or too little can be a bad thing. Hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism are conditions that, are unpleasant conditions to deal with. That, you have people who have thyroid issues, have issues with their weight and with their diet. It's really tough to get down. And in extreme cases, I think it leads to a disorder called cretinism, which I believe is a really extreme case of hyperthyroidism, or hypo, too little thyroxine in the body. So, that's really all for this class. It's really all you need to be aware of. I really just want you to be aware of just kind of the basic functions of each of these glands. You don't really need to have a full, know the history and everything these things do, but just broadly speaking, kind of what's going on with each gland. The adrenal glands, I think we talked about previously. Adrenal glands, they are atop of your kidneys. They have an outer layer, an inner layer, not all that important for this class, but just know that our adrenal glands produce cortical steroids or corticosteroids, and these are released during fight or flight. They also release epinephrine and norepinephrine during fight or flight and rest and digest, but corticosteroids are something that the body produces in response to stress and stressful situations, and by itself it's fine, but over time it can be kind of destructive to the body in the sense that it kind of cakes up, it builds up like a plaque over time in the walls of our arteries. And so this is one of the reasons why people develop heart disease over time. Chronically stressed, their body is just overwhelmed and flooded with these corticosteroids that over time just build and build and build, and then it becomes harder for blood to move throughout. So it's a good thing that our body does produce this substance, but chronically being exposed to it can be a problem. Again, it's one of those things, too much or too little, and you can easily see how the devastation or the impact and damage it can have on the body. So that's adrenal glands. Fight or flight, rest and digest. That's what I would think of when you're thinking of the adrenal glands. They release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Testes and ovaries, these are present. Testes are present if you are biologically a male. Ovaries are present if you're biologically a female. Testes tend to they produce testosterone, although females have small amounts of testosterone, but males have more, and it's produced by the testes. Also in the adrenal glands. And these are what, producing testosterone is what leads to the development of male characteristics, like developing, facial hair under their arms. I guess that's not just for males either. I shouldn't say that. But deeper voice, facial hair, physical stature, and growth in physical stature, those are regulated by testosterone, whereas estrogen and progesterone are primarily produced by, they're produced in women and they're produced in the ovaries. And these are leading to the development of physical maturation for females, development of breasts, becoming physically mature to the point where, you can rear a child, things like that. So both are really important. Both are vitally important for the development of males and females, biologically speaking, going from, being prepubescent to being pubescent. And then, of course, those testosterone, for example, can be impacted by the use of steroids and anabolic steroids. There's a lot of benefits of using these substances, but anything you read about, like increased muscle mass, heightened resistance to stress, increased energies, that all sounds so great. You hear about that. You're like, oh, why not sign me up for steroids? But then you hear about all the health problems that people have. If they take steroids for too long, it devastates your joints, people having heart attacks, all kinds of nasty things. It just doesn't seem worth it. But, in professional athletics and otherwise, some people try to get an edge through steroids by tapping into their body's natural testosterone. So anyways, let's move on and let's move out of the endocrine system and kind of talk about a bigger, larger theory that's being tossed around more and more in psychology, and that's Darwin's theory of evolution. If you're not familiar with Darwin's theory of evolution, I know that it's kind of frowned upon in the state of Oklahoma to teach about it, but it really taps into this idea of natural selection. Evolution, the idea of evolution was around long before Darwin published his ideas about the theory of natural selection. We've always sort of known that, well, maybe things evolve from other things, we can kind of trace that back, through archaeology and things like that. We can tell. But Darwin was one of the first people to propose that certain genetic characteristics are what allow for some species to thrive and survive. And through genetic variation, some species are selected, naturally speaking, to survive while others are not. And so this theory is really just trying to propose why do some species thrive and others? Some variations and mutations occur genetically, and this is what produces these differences. And sometimes mutations lead to benefits for some species, and those species go on and breed and keep reproducing these variations, and so on and so forth. And so it's a really fascinating topic, but there's some misconceptions. For one, there's misconceptions that Darwin was suggesting that human beings evolved from monkeys. Well, that's not really what Darwin was saying at all. Darwin was saying, hey, we have these cousins, these relatives, like the chimpanzee here and the Neanderthal here, that we have a lot of similarity to, but we didn't evolve from these chimpanzees or these Neanderthals, but rather there is a common ancestor somewhere way back in our evolutionary history, and that's kind of what we evolved from. If you trace back everything, we all have evolved from single-celled organisms, but we can get a little more specific when we're talking about human evolution and find a much more resemblant between chimps and humans and Neanderthals and other beings, other primates. But and also, natural selection is a process that takes place over hundreds of thousands, if not millions and millions of years. So it's not this overnight process that kind of like X-Men, where things evolve and mutate, and overnight they're a new species. No, it takes hundreds and thousands of generations before these mutations and variations really result in prolific changes in terms of species. So, a little bit of truth or fiction, check your comprehension. Charles Darwin was nearly excluded from the voyage that led to the development of his theory of evolution because the captain of the ship did not like the shape of his nose. Go ahead and pause the video. True or false? Check your comprehension. Welcome back. The answer is true. That statement is almost too specific not to be true, in my opinion. But apparently, the captain of the ship wasn't too fond of Darwin and almost made him stay home. And who knows what history would be like if Darwin didn't get to go to the Galapagos and study the finches and write about natural selection. I'm sure somebody else would have come along and produced some ideas similar, but maybe, who knows? We wouldn't be talking about Darwin's theory of evolution. It would be somebody else's. So, knowing a little more about natural selection, psychology, there's a new branch of psychology called evolutionary psychology that looks to apply Darwin's theory of natural selection to understanding how human beings not only survive but thrive, and what are the behaviors and the mental processes that allow for us to thrive and survive as a species. So we're going to be thinking about behavior in terms of natural selection. How is it this form of behavior or way of thinking allows for human beings to proliferate and to continue on? So, a lot of the focus in evolutionary psychology is on instinctive behaviors or species-specific behaviors. Instincts. They're stereotyped patterns of behavior triggered by a specific situation, and they are typically specific to a certain species. Human beings, compared to other animals, we don't have a lot of instinctual behavior, but we do have some. Some people would argue that human beings are sort of instinctually driven to be altruistic. You could argue that human beings are instinctively driven to seek out other human beings, like we are social beings by our very nature. So that sort of explains some of our behavior in that sense. So that's a big focus for evolutionary psychology is how are these small or grandiose or large patterns of behavior, how do they help us survive? What is the function that they serve? And again, a big focus on instincts is going to be species specific, looking at humans. What are the instincts of humans that allow us to survive and thrive? Maybe you might extend this to other organisms, but the big focus in evolutionary psychology is on human beings. Let's see. So, other important points of consideration when thinking about biology and behavior. The whole point of this chapter. Heredity is another important topic. How we inherit traits from our parents through genetic sequences. There's a whole subfield of biology that studies genetics. And within psychology, there's even a study called behavioral genetics, and it looks at, how does genetic variation lead to changes in behavior or contributions to our behavior? So it's a fairly new study compared to other sciences. So if you're not familiar, this is just a quick little, recap. The unit of heredity, what we inherit from our parents, are called genes. And those genes regulate the development of certain traits like eye color, your hair color, but they also could regulate certain traits, behavioral traits, like whether you're more extroverted or introverted, whether you're prone to mental illness or not. And genes are compiled together to make chromosomes. In human beings, we have 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs. You inherit 23 from your biological mother, 23 from your biological father. And those chromosomes are made up of DNA, otherwise known as deoxyribonucleic acid. The ladder-like strands you've probably seen ad nauseum from your science classes. I bet you didn't think you'd be bringing this stuff in psychology, but hey, that's part of it. It's part of the science of psychology. And here's the nuclei of cells with some chromosomes. Here's a better look at chromosomes, and here's the close-up look of DNA. So it kind of all builds into each other. The DNA builds the chromosomes, which build the cells. So here's just a close-up look of that. Figure 2.15 in your text has more information there. The Human Genome Project is a massive science undertaking that has been used to map out and sequence all of the human DNA, over 3 billion DNA sequences. I think it's still going. It's been ongoing for I think a couple decades now, but they're continuously adding on to this giant scientific endeavor, and it's really fascinating to read about. If you get a chance to, just Google Human Genome Project, and I think you'll be really impressed with some of the research you see. Within that project, there's a debate. How much do genetics contribute to psychological traits? That's part of behavioral genetics as well. What's going on between our ears? How much of that is influenced by genetics? That's one of the biggest debates kind of going on right now in psychology. Some of our traits, like eye color, for example, or hair color, are determined by a single pair of your genes. However, other traits, like whether or not you're an extrovert or introvert, or what your personality is like, are going to be determined by a number of a combination of genetics or traits, and that's otherwise known as polygenic. It takes up a lot of different genes to make up those traits, those more complex traits. Everything that you inherit from your parents is your genetic sequence, is your genotype. However, if you're familiar with Mendelian genetics, maybe you remember the name Gregor Mendel from elementary school. You don't inherit, you just because you inherit certain genes doesn't mean you express them. The genes that you express are called your phenotype. So maybe you have one parent who has brown hair and another parent who has blonde hair, but the fact that you express the brown hair, that is the phenotype, what is actually expressed. So, and what is expressed is influenced by the environment and other factors, which we'll talk about later. So it's not just as simple as inheriting the genetics. And out there, you also have to be in the right environment that is conducive for those genetics as well. Chromosomes, we talked about chromosomes a minute ago. You have 23 pairs from each parent. Your sex, your biological sex is determined by those chromosomes. 2 X's, of course, would result in being born biologically female. An X and a Y result in being born biologically male. The genetic disorder Down syndrome is a result of chromosomal abnormalities, specifically on the 21st chromosome. Down syndrome as a disorder, intellectual disability, again linked to genetics. It's a disorder we can pinpoint directly to genetics. It's not one of those things that's kind of, it could be caused by diet or caused by taking this or doing that. No, it links right back directly to genetics. And a lot of what we know about genetics comes through kinship studies. This is studying people who are related biologically or not, especially twin studies, studying monozygotic and diazygotic twins. Monozygotic twins are fraternal twins. Diazygotic twins it's the other way around. Monozygotic twins are identical twins. Diazygotic are fraternal twins. Monozygotic twins share the 100% of the same genetic information, whereas diazygotic only share 50%. It's the same as your brother or sister. They're no different genetically speaking. And the point of these exercises is to determine what is the role of genetics and what is the role of environment. So you have these really fascinating studies, these adoption studies that look at people who were born with the same genetics but were reared apart. For example, there's a really fascinating case study called the Ch twins. If you Google this, I'm sure you'll find a bunch of results. The Ch twins. Two identical twins by the name of Jim were separated at birth and did not and spent their entire lives apart until their 40s when they were finally reunited. And what they came to find out was, even though they lived in 2 different parts of the country and raised in 2 different households, they had a lot of the same similarities. They smoked the same kinds of cigarettes. They each married the same. The women they married had the same first name. It was like Beth or something. They had a lot of the same preferences for music and cars. I even think they had similar jobs. But obviously, you could probably go through the list and find a lot of differences too. But it's just so fascinating to see these 2 people have the same genetic sequence exactly. They're raised apart, yet they're so similar in some ways and so different in other ways. Fascinating stuff. So you can find other adoption studies like that. But if you want a really good case study example, Google the Ch twins, and I think you'll find the results to be a really, really fascinating study. And this is just showing you the degree of overlap in genetics at the different, at different levels of relatedness. Identical twins, for example, they share 100% of the same genetic material. That's why you hear about, certain diseases, like schizophrenia, for example. The general population only has a 1% chance of getting it. But if you have an identical twin who is schizophrenic, you have a 50% chance or more likelihood of developing it yourself because you have the same genetics. It's fascinating what that does, the role of genetics plays in things like disease or things like that. Fraternal twins are brothers and sisters, parent and child. They share 50% material. You share 25% with your grandparents, your grandchild, your aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, half-brothers, half-sisters, and so on and so forth. So you can take a look at that. And these are the things that people in genetics, behavioral genetics, psychology, they study these different populations to see, okay, how do they behave differently, when they're related and otherwise. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up Chapter 2. I know that's a lot to throw at you. Chapter 2 is probably one of the biggest chapters in the whole Rathus textbook. I promise future chapters will not be this long. But now you have a pretty good idea about the role of biology and how it influences behavior and how it influences the way we think. You now have a background in the brain, the endocrine system, the nervous system. If you've taken anatomy before, a lot of this is review. If you've taken biology before, a lot of this is review. But hey, review is not a bad thing. So we'll go ahead and stop here. And when we come back, we're going to jump into chapter 3, which is on sensation and perception. There are some elements of anatomy and biology in this next chapter too. So don't take off your biology cap just yet. We will kind of review some of these ideas again further. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you all in chapter 3. Take care.